Let's talk about exposure, but exposure from a creative standpoint. So this is kind of like the chicken and the egg situation. Which do you explain first before you explain the other? And there's a little thing that I'm going to explain in here about composite modes / blend modes, as would be called in Photoshop. But I just want to give you a little preview of the concept of blend modes and how you can creatively expose your footage. Now, normally when you want to expose something, you have the exposure right here. So you could just move it up. Let me go over to this. No, better. Let me go over to the parade. Okay. So here you can see the exposure, how much light is in the scene. So you can, this is the normal way as we know. That's one way. As you know, over here also, you can just up the gain to also do your exposure. So you have multiple ways of doing your exposure, but what I want to show you is a more, not I would say advanced, could be seen as advanced, but let's say a more creative way to do exposure. And this can be a part of the correction aspect of your color grading, color fixing, etc. So short recap, color correction is the part where you just simply bring the balance in place, bring the right contrast, fix the exposure, set the saturation to the right point, but you ain't doing nothing creative. You're just creating a foundation on which you can do all else that you need to do. And quite often in the color correction phase, you also could be doing shot matching so that you can bring things a bit in balance. Not always, but you can do the shot matching there. But let's get into it so you can get a better idea. Let me give this a name. Exposure. Okay, this is our first exposure node. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to add one node and I'm going to create a parallel node. You do that by right clicking and you can choose, let me see here, it is add node, then you go parallel. That's the shortcut key. I am going to be using the shortcut key so that things can go quickly, but at least now you see where you can find it in the menu. So I right click on top of the node and then I went to here. So that adds it. Okay, let me add one more node. You'll see in a moment why I added this node. And I'm going to add one here. And I'm also going to call it mul. Okay, so normally when you want to set exposure, let's stay inside of this HDR palette. You bring up the exposure a bit and you're like, yeah, that's a good exposure. You like how bright it is. And then what you would do normally, let me take one back. Let me copy this forward. One sec. Hold command. By holding command and drag, you switch them around. Let me see. Let's save. Yep. Okay. And then from after you do your exposure, quite often then you would do, or not quite often, that's the thing you would do. Before this, one other thing, before this normally you would put a balance node to you balance your shot, then you expose it. But I just want to try to keep it simple. And then you would do your contrast here. Let me just name it contrast. Bear with me while I show you this new idea. It's something that I was thinking about and I was like, hey, that's an interesting way to do exposure. So now what you would do is you would set your contrast, you know, and as if you look at in the scope, it changes up and down, and that's based on the pivot point, but we can get in pivot points later. But you can see we're creating the contrast, deepening the image, right? Okay, now let me show you a different way to set exposure, but also it kind of gives it a contrast, a look. You go into your node, you right click it, you go down to composite mode, then you go down and you choose multiply. Let me see where it is. There. Now, let me reset this. Oh, let me do it a little different. Let me reset this grid. Let me see, just add. Yeah, okay. So I'm going to leave this as the plain one. I'm going to create one new version. Create a new version. and I'm going to call this mult. P-mult for parallel mult. For parallel multiply. Okay, I'm going to go one back by holding Command and a B. So now I'm version 1. I go up. Let me rename this into just simply exposure. Okay, so now this is the version where we have, I'm going to be going back and forth with Command B and Command N. So before and next, that's what the B and the N means. So what I'm going to do, if you look at this, this is my basic exposure, as I was saying. Simple, straightforward exposure. It hits 640 and you can see how it looks. Now, if we go to the next version, multiply, what I'm going to do is go one back. Let me copy the exact settings. That's 131. Come over here and we do 131. Oh, mistake, I have to put it here. 131. Okay, so that 131. So we have, in essence, the same marker. We have the same color grade, or I should say the same exposure on both if you look at the scopes. Okay, so now we go over to the mult. This is a parallel. I go here and I choose multiply. It instantly gets darker. What multiply does is it keeps the black, it removes the white. That's why it does. It darkens the image, but in a specific way. So what I want to do is go back to my exposure here and I up it. I bring it up to the same 640. Now I'm going to jump back to the previous. Notice that both of them are reaching at 640. But with the mult, we're now on top of the exposure only. And now we're on the mult. You notice that it automatically, with the same exposure setting, it automatically sets a kind of contrast kind of look to it. Now you might think, okay, couldn't you just have done the contrast and gotten the same? I'm going to show you the comparison with the contrast in a moment. But before we go ahead with that, I'm going to do a version where I'm going to put the multiply in a serial connection, let's say. So I just want to show you that it doesn't make a difference if it's in parallel or if it's in a serial. Let me go into creating a new version. Create a new version, and we're going to call this S mult. Okay, so now we're going to turn, let's see, we're going to turn this one off. And we go over to here and we're going to turn this into multiply. So now I'm going to jump in between the two versions. So this is the serial version because I just have this turned off. So everything just flows through and goes to there. This is serial. We're looking at the parallel. Serial, parallel. See, there's no difference. Even if you look down at the scopes, you can see nothing different is happening here. Okay. Now we're back to the original exposure. Now, let's say, for instance, you're like, okay, let's see if we could do the same contrasting, just using contrast to get the same look. But remember, multiply doing a little different thing is that it is looking at what's black and it is then keeping that. The black is black, it keeps, and anything that is white, pure white, it is removing. And then it's a gradation from the whitest white down to the blackest black as it's doing its math. That creates a specific type of look when you are then using a blend mode like that instead of just contrast. So we're going to go into the contrast and I'm going to change the contrast. Let's go back to the original. Yeah. And we here, as you can see, normal. So we do not have a multiply on top of it. I'm going to take this and I'm going to try, and I'm going to do a compare. I'm going to explain this in more detail in the future. I'll go up to here and I'm looking at now all the versions. Now down here I can see three things at the same time. So I'm going to say, I want to see if I can get that one. You see, I could look at that. I can bring it down to there. Let's say even if I bring it, I'm just purely looking at here and I keep bringing it. Oh, made a mistake there. I keep bringing it down until, or carrying it up. You notice I can't get the same look. The richness in colors and everything I'm seeing here is different when you're just doing a contrast. You see, no matter how I move it, it doesn't give the same look. This more look crushed. The blacks look more grayish. You can look and see it here even on this part. Whilst having that same kind of richness, contrast, you can see this looks more pleasing. You know, it doesn't look crushed. It doesn't look washed out, because as you move contrast, you have to understand that contrast then washes out the image as you increase your contrast, because you're saying I'm spreading the same amount of colors over a longer distance. So that then diminishes your saturation, which thereafter then you would have a saturation node to then up the saturation. But here we are, in essence, the way that I'm doing it right now, when we are working in the version where, because now I'm in the multiply version where I use the multiplier with nothing on the contrast, you can see you have this rich look to it. And I think that's also a nice starting point to have when you're doing your exposure. But this is more of a, let's say, a creative exposure. But bear in mind, due to the fact that you are using a multiply in the tree, another shot is going to look different with the multiply in it. So it might make shot matching a little more tricky, because it's math based on the image itself. So I would think you have to also be mindful of that. In the tutorial when I do on shot matching, I'm going to go into the best way I think. Well, there's not really always the best way. One of the creative ways, the way that I would look at to do shot matching, and I am going to go through how to avoid ending up in a situation where you keep changing things, trying to get to the end result that you never can get to. So in essence, what I'm trying to show you here is a new creative way to do exposure. The concept of composite modes, here's the entire list of blend modes that you can use, and they can be quite helpful in creating a look. If you are busy creating a look, those multiplies can really make a huge difference. As you can see, it basically created a look in and of itself. And what I just wanted to show you with these different versions is that whether it is in serial or whether it is in parallel, that doesn't matter. Only time it's then going to matter is if I go in and I change something like adding something here, where you go. So then naturally it's going to do the, let me see, one sec here. Which one am I in? That's the serial. Let me undo that. One moment. Let me undo this one. Yep. Okay. Let me go over into the parallel version. Yeah. So here the mult is active. And here this mult is not active. Okay. So if I go in here and I make a change, then this is going to do what a parallel node does, is that it will blend it evenly with each other, but bearing in mind that something here is happening with a composite mode. The composite mode works on the node itself, so it doesn't need to be in parallel to do its thing, as I was showing you with just having it here in the serial. So it could just be straight into it, and the multiplication happens on the node itself. So it doesn't need to look at, you know, multiple nodes to get that same effect. But yeah, I hope this gives you a new creative idea and way of looking at exposure or doing exposure. And this technique here can also just be used in the color grading phase, where you just want to do a look development stage. So using the different blend modes can be very handy in helping you to craft a look. I hope this gives you some sort of inspirational idea in looking at things a little different. I think this is a nice creative way to have a not a standard exposure happening, where you are, when you are, how you would say, doing your exposure, that you are adding a bit of balance back into it and not just washing out your image as you change. Because as you can see here, this has a really nice effect when you are moving. Let's see, let's reset this, go back to here. It has a nice effect when you are just moving it in exposure. Whereas, oh, mistake. Let's see, go over here, check what the exposure is on the exposure here is 268. Go here, 268, yeah. So when you are over in this version where we're just doing exposure without any multiply, so I could just turn them off so that it doesn't be confusing. You can see with using contrast, we get a completely different effect, that we don't keep that richness. No matter what you do or try, it doesn't have that kind of warmth to it, that kind of, yeah, like richness to the colors, etc. It goes more grayish than anything else. So maybe you can use this as a standard way for your exposure. One thing I forgot to explain, the idea of where the mult is. So I want to show you something, and I think that's important to realize. And that is a key difference, because you saw me putting it into a separate node. But what I've done now is I've made a copy of the original exposure, and just it's the exact same. So what I'm going to do is make one slight difference. I've turned off both of the multiplications, but this time I'm going to put the mult, and I just so you can verify, it's the exposure is 131. Over here it is 131. And when you look into the mult versions, what I've had the exposure on is 268, and this number is going to be very important. So when I go back to the exposure mult now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this into a mult. And I am going to, let me see here, multiply. Okay. Now, here's a kicker, and you notice it one time. It's darker, but let's put it on the 268 what we had. 2.68. Okay, just to double check, go over here. How much is it? 268 on the exposure. It's also mult. But because the mult is now on the exposure node itself, it's a completely different animal. So you have to also keep that in mind when you are also adding the mult, that by adding it on the exposure node itself, that has a different effect. So bear that in mind. So I'm going to see if I can get the same look. And look how high I have to pull the exposure to even start to come into the same area. I can't even go any further than that. It's all the way up on 6. Because what is happening now is that the multiplication is happening immediately as you are adding the exposure. So it is fighting your exposure one time. Instead of getting an exposed image in a certain way, doing its math and then passing it on. So I hope that helps. I think that was a very important little thing to have in there, to the realization, so that it doesn't create what is called a gotcha, you know? So you know that a part of how I set this up is that it needs to be on its own node by itself. And the reason why I have it also downstream like this is because I want to show you, hey, it can be placed further down your timeline, but what I would want, not timeline, node tree, but what I would advise is to have the mult in real world. I would advise you to put the mult here so that the mult can function before the contrast, before the saturation, but the balancing happens before the exposure. So the fact that you see it back here was just mainly because I was looking at a concept without the contrast, and I was just trying to show you how the contrast affects how you say the look, because it would have, if the contrast example I wasn't making, it would have been directly behind it. As you see, this wouldn't have been there. So let me see. Yeah, so normally what you would want to do is you go here and I put this back on to 1.31. And then I go here and I turn this into a mult. And let me check the sat. Then what has happened now? Did I put it on something else? It's on the multiply. Give me a moment. This is always interesting to do, I just call it debugging. I'm going to continue recording so you can see sometimes how things will go wrong and what exactly went wrong here in this moment. Let me see. Let me see if that's the case. Oh, yeah. So the saturation, the exposure actually had to go up to 2.68 and turn that off. Let's see if that was it. Okay, that wasn't it. Let's see what else. Oh, is it this? No. 268. Let's reset this and see what happens. Let's take a look here. I think it's sometimes good to see here, 131. Yeah, go over to here, turn this on, put 1.31. Okay, now it's back. For some reason now that works. And yeah, as I was trying to show, then I put the mult here, and the mult versions came to 2.68. So yeah, so this is how you would want to put it if you're doing your color correction node situation. And then that as you can see, they are the exact same. So I hope this makes things very, very clear for you in how the creation of that look, the color grading, the color correction can be done in so many different ways. And that is what makes DaVinci Resolve so powerful. And we only start to scratch the surface. Bear in mind that DaVinci Resolve's manual is over 4,000 pages long, the manual. So that kind of brings things in perspective of how much this application can do. And this is only the color tab. That's about it. So if you have any questions, post any questions and then I can answer them. Some of the things that I explained here, it's kind of what I said, the chicken and the egg situation. I need to first explain you about how parallel nodes is, or I needed to explain you the concept of blend modes, but I wanted to focus on exposure. So I just, say like, hey, bear with me. I'm going to come back to it in more detail, but at least now you have this extra style of creating exposure. All right, that's it. See you in the next video.